That night changed everything. I didn't know it then, but nothing would ever be the same again. The house was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of crickets outside. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening over and over again. Everything had seemed normal at first. Dinner with my best friend's family, the usual jokes, the easy conversation. But there was something in the air, something unspoken that had shifted between us. The feeling in my chest was heavy, and I couldn't shake the unease that clung to me. The night had started innocently enough, like so many others. I had come over for dinner, just as I always did. It was the usual routine: talk about school, laugh over inside jokes, and share stories. I never imagined that anything would change tonight. Yet, after dinner, when everyone else went to bed, I stayed behind to help clean up in the kitchen. And that's when it happened. It wasn't much at first, just a lingering glance, a moment that stretched just a little too long. But something about the way my best friend's dad looked at me made my heart skip a beat. He'd always been a warm, kind man, someone I'd known my whole life. But tonight, his gaze held something more. It wasn't the way he looked at me like a child, as he always had. This was different. His eyes seemed to search mine for a moment, a flicker of something I couldn't place. And then, just as quickly, he looked away, like he hadn't meant to do it at all. But the damage had been done. I tried to push it out of my mind, assuming it was nothing, a mistake, a momentary lapse. But as I stood there, wiping down the counter, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. His presence in the room felt charged, different from all the times before. And when he spoke, his voice was softer, more deliberate, as if he was weighing each word. "You're a good kid," he'd said. Simple, harmless, even reassuring. But I couldn't ignore the undercurrent that flowed beneath his words, the unspoken tension that lingered between us. Now, in the quiet of my room, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My mind raced, questioning what it all meant. Was it just me overthinking things? Or was there something more? I turned onto my side, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled in my stomach. The silence in my room was suffocating. I felt so many emotions: confusion, guilt, curiosity. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. My best friend's dad had always been just that, a father figure. But now, there was something else in the air, something unspoken that hung between us, and I had no idea what to do with it. I closed my eyes, but the moment replayed in my head, the way he'd looked at me, the subtle shift in his tone. It wasn't just a passing thought. It wasn't just a moment of awkwardness. It was something more, something that I wasn't sure I was ready to face. As much as I wanted to push it away, I couldn't. Tonight had changed everything. And I didn't know how to fix it, or if I even should. I was left there, alone with my thoughts, feeling like I was on the edge of something that I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. The relationship between the protagonist and their best friend's dad had always been simple, almost familial. Growing up, the protagonist had spent countless hours at their best friend's house, part of the rhythm of their everyday life. It was a place where they felt comfortable, like they belonged. Their best friend's dad was always there, the quiet but steady presence in the background. He wasn't overly involved, but there was a warmth in his demeanor that made him approachable. He would offer advice when needed, share a joke now and then, and never make the protagonist feel out of place. The protagonist had always seen him in the way you see any parent of a close friend, as a fixture in the background of their life. There was never any real reason to think much about him beyond that. He was just dad, the one who made sure the house was stocked with snacks for movie nights, who gave out rides to and from parties, who cracked dad jokes with a grin. To the protagonist, he was a little awkward at times but always kind. But over the years, those once clear boundaries had begun to blur. Their friendship with the best friend had blossomed over time, and with it, the presence of the dad had become more of a background hum. The protagonist's relationship with the dad was never close in a personal sense, but they had shared countless interactions over the years, always polite, friendly, and casual. Sometimes, the three of them would sit together for dinner, talking about school, life, and whatever came up. On other occasions, the protagonist would find themselves alone with the dad, helping him out in the kitchen or watching a game. Those moments were always comfortable. There was a certain routine to them. The dad would ask about school, offering advice about everything from grades to relationships. The protagonist would laugh, respond with a few awkward comments, and they'd share a moment of mutual understanding. There was no sense of danger or discomfort. It was simply two people passing the time, exchanging pleasantries, without any sense that anything could go wrong. Yet, lately, there had been a shift. The protagonist had begun to notice little things. Not at first, but over time, the dad's attention had subtly changed. It was hard to put a finger on it, a slight change in tone, a prolonged gaze, moments when the dad would seem to linger just a little longer than necessary. The protagonist would often brush it off, assuming it was nothing, just some harmless moment of awkwardness. After all, it was natural for people to change as they grew older, and these moments could easily be overlooked. But there were times, fleeting though they were, when it became impossible to ignore. They weren't glaringly obvious, these shifts in behavior, but there were subtle changes in the way the dad interacted. He would give the protagonist a smile that lingered a little longer than usual, or say something that, in retrospect, seemed to carry a deeper meaning. It wasn't anything that screamed discomfort, but it made the protagonist feel strangely aware of their surroundings, more attuned to what was happening than they had been before. One evening, after a long day of school and a casual hangout at the house, the protagonist found themselves alone with the dad in the kitchen again, cleaning up. It was the same routine, nothing special. They were washing dishes, their conversation light. Yet, for some reason, tonight felt different. As they joked about the mess they'd made, the dad's usual easygoing demeanor felt charged. There was a hesitation in his voice, a softness in the way he spoke. It wasn't something the protagonist could easily explain, but it was there, like a quiet undercurrent, just beneath the surface. After a few minutes of comfortable silence, the dad spoke again. "You know, you've grown up so much. I remember when you were just a kid running around the house." His voice held an emotion that the protagonist couldn't quite place, a note of affection tinged with something else, something unfamiliar. The protagonist smiled, unsure of how to respond. "Yeah, time flies," they said, trying to keep the conversation light. But the dad's gaze seemed to linger on them for a moment too long, and for a brief second, their eyes locked. It was subtle, but the moment was charged, filled with an electricity that had never been there before. The protagonist quickly broke the gaze, feeling an odd flush rise in their chest. They tried to push the feeling away, chalking it up to exhaustion or maybe just an odd moment. But as the conversation continued, the dad's words took on a different tone. They were no longer just a casual exchange. They were more deliberate, heavier with unspoken meaning. The protagonist felt it, but they couldn't figure out why it made them feel so unsettled. There was a silence between them, and then the dad made an offhand comment. "I hope you know you're always welcome here. You're part of the family." His voice was warm, reassuring, but there was something beneath it, a layer of something else that the protagonist couldn't identify. It wasn't quite concern, but it felt personal, more intimate than anything they had ever shared before. The words hung in the air like a soft tension, and for a moment, the protagonist wondered if they had imagined the entire thing. But it wasn't just tonight. The subtle shifts in the dad's behavior had been happening over time. When the protagonist and their best friend hung out, the dad seemed to always be around more, lingering in the background with a watchful eye. He would offer advice, but there was always a quiet intensity in his presence. He started to make more jokes directed specifically at the protagonist, ones that seemed just a little too pointed. Each time, the protagonist found themselves looking at him differently, trying to make sense of the new dynamic. They had always gotten along, but now there was something else, something unspoken hanging in the air. The protagonist often found themselves replaying these moments in their mind, trying to figure out if they were imagining things or if something had really changed. They couldn't deny the way the dad made them feel. It was confusing, and it made them question everything they had known about their friendship, about their relationship with him. But more than that, it made them question their own feelings. What was happening between them? How had something so simple, so innocent, become so complicated? The answers weren't clear, and the more the protagonist thought about it, the less certain they became. But one thing was undeniable: the dynamic between them had shifted, and now everything felt uncertain. As the days passed, the shift in the dynamic between the protagonist and their best friend's dad became more pronounced. At first, it was subtle, small, almost imperceptible moments that seemed like nothing at all. A lingering glance, a casual touch on the shoulder, an unexpected compliment. But each time these moments occurred, the protagonist's heart would skip a beat, and they'd wonder if they were just imagining it. Over time, though, it became harder to deny that something had changed. It was on a Saturday afternoon, just a week after that strange charged moment in the kitchen, when the first real sign of change hit the protagonist. They had been hanging out with their best friend, like they always did, when the dad came into the living room, casually mentioning that he was heading out to the store. It wasn't unusual. He would often run errands, leaving the protagonist and their best friend to hang out on their own. But this time, he seemed to linger in the doorway a bit longer than usual, looking over at the protagonist with a smile that felt different. It was softer, more knowing. "Hey, you need anything?" he asked. His tone was light, but there was an undertone that made the protagonist's skin prickle. They shook their head, unsure of what to say. The dad's gaze held theirs for a moment, just a fraction too long. There was something in those eyes, something deeper, something that made the protagonist's heart race. They quickly looked away, feeling their face flush with heat. It wasn't just the dad's attention that had changed, the protagonist's own response to it had shifted too. Later that afternoon, when the protagonist was helping the dad in the garage, the awkwardness of the moment returned. They were both working on fixing a broken shelf, and the dad was leaning over, his hand brushing against the protagonist's arm as he reached for a tool. The touch was brief, but it was enough to make the protagonist freeze, a strange shiver running through them. They couldn't explain it. The simple touch seemed loaded with meaning. It was an accidental touch, they told themselves, nothing more. But it felt intentional. The dad's gaze flickered to theirs for a split second, and then he quickly looked away, almost as if he too was startled by the contact. For the rest of the afternoon, the silence between them felt thicker, more charged. They continued working side by side, but now, every small movement seemed to carry more weight. Every word was laced with a layer of unspoken understanding that neither of them could quite articulate. The protagonist could feel the shift within themselves too. They had always felt comfortable around the dad. He was just a figure in the background of their life. But now, his presence was something different. It made them nervous in a way they couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the physical proximity or the way their bodies brushed together, it was the way the dad started to act around them. There were moments when he would offer advice, but it felt more personal now, more directed at the protagonist's own struggles, rather than general advice. He started to ask more about the protagonist's life, not in a casual way, but as though he genuinely cared, more than a parent would typically ask a friend's child. There was an intimacy in his questions that made the protagonist feel vulnerable, as if their every answer was being measured, analyzed, in a way that hadn't happened before. One evening, when the protagonist and their best friend were playing video games in the living room, the dad came in, as he often did. He dropped down onto the couch beside them, but instead of sitting back casually, as he usually did, he leaned in a little too close. He was asking about the protagonist's day, but there was a softness to his voice, a tenderness that made the protagonist feel exposed. Every time they looked up at him, he was watching them with an intensity they hadn't seen before. And when their eyes met, the dad didn't look away immediately. It was a long, searching gaze, as though he were trying to see something the protagonist wasn't ready to reveal. The protagonist, unsure of how to handle the shift, tried to ignore the way the dad was making them feel. They focused on their best friend, on the game they were playing, trying to drown out the constant awareness of the dad sitting next to them. But the more they tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to intensify. There were moments when the dad would touch the protagonist's shoulder casually, his hand resting there just a little too long. It wasn't anything overt or inappropriate, but the touch seemed to speak volumes, and the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more being communicated than just a friendly gesture. The shift in dynamic wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. The protagonist began to notice how differently the dad spoke to them now. His words were laced with something deeper, something more intimate. He would compliment them on things that were more personal, things they didn't expect from a parental figure. "You're really growing into someone special," he said one evening, as they were sitting together in the living room. The words were kind, but there was a certain weight behind them, a sense of admiration that made the protagonist feel uncomfortable in the best way. The dad's affection wasn't expressed overtly, it was subtle, almost hidden beneath layers of normalcy. But the protagonist felt it with every glance, every touch, every word. It wasn't until one evening, when they found themselves alone with him in the kitchen, that it all seemed to come to a head. They were preparing dinner together, chopping vegetables side by side, when the dad leaned in just a little too close as he reached for the spice rack. His arm brushed against the protagonist's back, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The dad's hand lingered there, his fingers brushing against the small of the protagonist's back before he quickly pulled away, as if he had just realized what he had done. The protagonist could feel their breath catch in their throat, their heart hammering in their chest. They tried to brush it off, but the tension in the air was undeniable. They had always known the dad as a figure of comfort, someone who was just there in the background of their life. But now, he was someone different. There was a line that had been crossed, or maybe it was a line they hadn't even realized existed. Either way, it made everything feel uncertain. And as the dad continued to act with a strange gentleness, a quiet intensity, the protagonist couldn't help but feel drawn to him in a way they didn't fully understand. The tension was building, and the protagonist could no longer deny that something was shifting. It was impossible to ignore the way their body responded to the dad's presence, the way their heart raced at every glance, every touch. What had started as a simple friendship had now become something more complicated, and the protagonist didn't know how to navigate it. There was an unspoken tension between them, a weight in the air that neither could ignore, but neither could address. It was like they were both trapped in a space where everything had changed, but neither knew how to acknowledge it. The shift in dynamic was undeniable, and the protagonist had no idea where it would lead. The tension had been building for weeks, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. The protagonist's every interaction with the dad was loaded with unspoken words, quiet looks, and moments that lingered just a little too long. It was the silence that hung between them, too heavy to be passed off as coincidence, too intense to be easily shrugged off, that pushed the protagonist to the brink. They had tried to distance themselves, tried to pretend that everything was normal, but it wasn't. And deep down, they knew that something had to give. It was late one evening when it finally happened. The protagonist was alone in the living room, flipping through TV channels, trying to distract themselves from the constant noise of their thoughts. Their best friend had gone out with some friends, leaving them alone with the dad for the first time in days. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. It was the perfect kind of evening, quiet, peaceful, and yet for some reason full of tension. The dad had been acting a little different that evening. Distant, almost as if he were waiting for something, too. When he entered the living room, there was a moment where neither of them said anything. They just stared at each other for a few seconds, the weight of everything hanging in the air. It was a look the protagonist had seen before, but this time, it felt different. There was something raw in it, something unsaid that begged to be spoken. "Hey," the dad said, his voice softer than usual, a slight tremble in it. "Can we talk?" The simple words sent a ripple of unease through the protagonist. They nodded, trying to mask the nervous flutter in their chest. They could feel the atmosphere shift, and though they had always prided themselves on keeping their cool, this time, their heart was racing in their chest. They knew what was coming, even if they weren't sure how to handle it. They moved to the couch, sitting a few feet apart, their bodies tense as if bracing for impact. The dad sat down slowly, as if measuring each movement, his eyes never leaving the protagonist's face. He seemed to hesitate, as though searching for the right words, but the silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating. Finally, he spoke. "I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think you know. I felt it for a while now. This tension between us." The words hit the protagonist like a wave, crashing over them, but at the same time, they felt a strange sense of relief. They weren't crazy, they weren't imagining things. It wasn't just them. The dad had noticed, too. "I don't want to make things awkward," he continued, his voice laced with uncertainty. "But I can't keep pretending like nothing is going on. The way I look at you, it's changed." He paused, as if measuring his own words. "I've never felt this way before, but I can't deny it. I think about you in ways I shouldn't." The admission hung in the air, both a confession and a challenge. The protagonist could feel their chest tighten. They didn't know what to say. Part of them wanted to run, to flee from the room and pretend none of this had ever happened. But another part of them, one they couldn't deny, was drawn to the dad, feeling that same magnetic pull they had been trying to ignore for weeks. The silence stretched between them again, thick with the weight of their unspoken thoughts. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this," the dad said, his eyes searching the protagonist's face for any sign of understanding. "I don't want to hurt anyone. I don't want to do something that will ruin everything. But I can't lie anymore." The protagonist felt as though their heart was beating in their throat, each word from the dad sending shockwaves through them. They were terrified of what this meant, terrified of what it would do to their relationship with both the dad and their best friend. But at the same time, there was a part of them that couldn't ignore the deep ache inside, the longing that had been growing ever since that first moment of tension. It was a complicated mess of emotions, and they didn't know how to untangle it. "I don't know what I want either," the protagonist finally said, their voice barely above a whisper. "I've been feeling something. But I don't know if I'm ready for this." The dad nodded slowly, his face full of empathy and understanding. "I don't expect anything from you," he said softly. "I just needed to tell you. I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I know it's wrong, and I know this might change everything. But I couldn't pretend like I didn't feel it." The room was heavy with the tension of their confessions. It was the first time either of them had spoken the truth aloud, and now that it was out in the open, there was no going back. The protagonist could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them. They were on the edge, caught between the pull of something they didn't fully understand and the fear of what it would cost them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, each second dragging on like an eternity. The dad's hand was resting on the arm of the couch, and for a moment, the protagonist's gaze lingered on it. It felt like the space between them had shrunk, like the air had grown thick with possibility. Finally, the dad broke the silence. "I never meant to put you in a position where you had to make a decision," he said softly. "But I need to know if you feel the same way. If you don't, I'll back off. I promise. But I can't pretend anymore, and I won't." The protagonist's mind was racing, their emotions a tangled mess. They had always admired the dad, looked up to him, but now, the nature of that admiration had changed. There was a sense of vulnerability, a sense of fear and excitement mixing together. They were at a crossroads, standing on the edge of something they didn't know if they were ready for. "I don't know what I feel," the protagonist admitted, their voice cracking slightly. "But I don't want to lose what we have. I don't want to hurt anyone." The dad's expression softened, his eyes full of a strange mixture of relief and sadness. "I understand," he said gently. "I don't want to push you. Whatever happens, I just needed you to know the truth." The words hung in the air, the silence between them now filled with the weight of their unspoken emotions. They weren't sure what the future held, but they both knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The protagonist was left with more questions than answers, the lines between right and wrong blurred in a way they didn't fully understand. But they were standing at the precipice, caught between the past and the future, unsure of where they would land. The silence lingered long after the confession. The dad, still sitting across from the protagonist, seemed to wait for something. An answer, a sign, perhaps a shift in the air. The weight of the conversation hung over them both like a storm cloud, heavy and threatening. The protagonist, lost in their own thoughts, couldn't bring themselves to move or speak. Their mind was racing, every emotion vying for dominance. They didn't know if they were relieved to have the truth out in the open or terrified by the magnitude of what had just been said. The dad's eyes were full of understanding and concern, but also a quiet sadness. He knew he had put them in an impossible situation. But he couldn't help it, he had to say it. He had to release the truth that had been slowly building up inside of him, even though it threatened to unravel everything. "I'm sorry," the dad said quietly, breaking the stillness. "I never meant to put this on you. I never meant for things to get complicated." The protagonist nodded but didn't speak. They could hear the sincerity in his voice, but it wasn't enough to ease the turmoil inside. The weight of the moment still crushed them, making it hard to think clearly. There was no easy way out of this. Whatever they decided, everything was going to change. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. The room, once familiar and safe, now felt like an alien place, full of tension and possibilities. Every second that passed seemed to amplify the confusion, but also the undeniable connection that had been growing between them. Even as the protagonist felt the fear and uncertainty rising within them, there was a strange pull, something magnetic that they couldn't explain. "I don't know how to handle this," the protagonist said, finally speaking their truth. "I don't know what this means for us, or for me." The dad nodded slowly, as if expecting this. "I understand. It's a lot to take in." He paused, his voice low and gentle. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm not even asking you to make a decision right now. I needed to be honest. I couldn't keep hiding it." The protagonist took a deep breath, trying to steady themselves. They could feel the weight of his words, but they didn't know what to do with them. Their emotions were still too raw, too confused. A part of them wanted to run, to get away from the tangled mess they found themselves in. But another part, the part that had always been drawn to the dad, that had felt something shifting between them for so long, didn't want to let go. What if I don't know what I feel? The protagonist asked quietly, their voice tinged with uncertainty. What if I'm not ready to figure it out? That's okay, the dad replied, his voice steady and calm. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. I won't push you. The relief that washed over the protagonist was almost suffocating. The pressure had been building, but now, in the quiet aftermath, there was a sense of calm that settled over them. The future was uncertain, and the road ahead was anything but clear. But for the first time in what felt like forever, they didn't have to have all the answers. They didn't have to rush into anything. For a moment, they just sat there, the weight of the world still hanging in the air, but no longer suffocating them. The dad, too, seemed to relax, his shoulders dropping in a way that suggested the burden of confession had lifted from him, even if only a little. He wasn't expecting a resolution tonight, and neither was the protagonist. They both knew that this conversation was just the beginning of something much larger, something neither of them could predict. I don't know where this will go, the protagonist said, their voice barely above a whisper. But I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. The dad smiled faintly, a look of understanding in his eyes. That's all I need. I'm here, whenever you're ready. The room seemed to exhale, the tension slowly dissipating, though the unspoken emotions still swirled between them. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but in that moment, there was a strange sense of peace. They had spoken their truths, and though it didn't solve everything, it had opened a door. They were no longer living in the uncertainty of silence, no longer pretending that nothing had changed. The protagonist stood up, the heaviness of the moment still settling in their chest. They weren't sure how to move forward, but they knew that they didn't need to have it all figured out tonight. There was time. The dad stood up as well, giving them a small, understanding smile, one that didn't expect anything more from them than honesty. As they stood there in the dim light of the living room, the protagonist realized that this moment wasn't an ending. It wasn't a clear-cut resolution or a neatly tied-up story. It was just the beginning, an open-ended chapter in a much larger narrative. What they would do with it, how they would navigate the complexities of their feelings, was still to be seen. But for now, they didn't have to make a decision. They could breathe, they could process, and they could figure things out at their own pace. Thank you, the protagonist said, their voice quieter now, filled with a sense of gratitude. For being patient. For being honest. The dad's expression softened, and he nodded. Anytime. As the protagonist turned to leave the room, the uncertainty of the future still loomed large. But as they stepped into the hallway, there was a flicker of something else, a glimmer of hope. The road ahead might be uncertain, but they knew they weren't alone. And in that moment, it was enough to carry them through. With that said, thanks for watching. And until next time.